So we are just starting Matthew's 5th section. I did my sort of outlining introductory phase last time, and now we can get into the actual 5th section of Matthew, which I titled last time, The Suffering King Explains His Kingdom, trying to hit on some of the main themes that we're going to see really from this point in chapter 16, verse 21, through to the end of chapter 20 is what I marked out as Matthew's 5th section. And this passage today is the first passage that is pretty much entirely inside that 5th section. I know Matthew likes his transitional phasing that he does, but this is the first part that really is in section 5. So let's read our passage for today. Matthew 16, verse 21 through 25 is as far as we're going to get. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised up on the third day. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. Then Jesus said to his disciples, If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And as I've been preparing these messages, there's a lot of kind of staggering. I go through like verse 25 here, but we'll actually start next time more like in verse 24, and then go a little further, and then like back up again. It's all like overlapping itself, so it's kind of a strange set of messages I have coming up where there's just a lot to say on all of this, and you're kind of overlapping it all. But from verse 21 through 25 is what I'm covering today. This message, I've given it a title that has a double meaning, and that title is Suffering for Life. And the double meaning really focuses on the word for there, suffering for life. I mean two things by that. First, I do mean duration, that is length of time. How long does the suffering last? It lasts a lifetime, so suffering for life. But I also mean motivation as the other meaning of this, the other part of this. Why endure that suffering? Why have a life of that sort? Well, it is in fact to gain life. So both duration and motivation in that phrase, suffering for life. I think in this passage we see both ideas, that the kingdom of heaven requires this suffering for life, both a lifetime of suffering, but then also a motivation of suffering that is leading you toward life. And I have 3 points I want to make on this passage. First of all, that Jesus will soon win the victory of resurrection through the suffering of death. And then secondly, that Jesus embraces suffering for life in spite of opposition from both earth and hell, as represented by Peter and Satan, as we see in the passage. And then my third point is that Jesus requires the disciples to share his resurrection by sharing his death. So the disciples of Jesus are going to find themselves following Christ in more ways than one, both in his resurrection, but first of all his death. Now, in all of this, we have this emphasis on death and resurrection, and you really should not have expected anything else out of a religion that is so very much tied to those two ideas, death and resurrection. Our very symbol, the cross, that we like to hang around our neck and everything. It's an instrument of death by torture. This emblem that we've adopted to summarize what we believe is very much a symbol of execution. And from the very beginning, the author and perfecter of our faith, Jesus, from that very beginning, from that first man, we've been a people who have embraced hardship. It's been part of the requirement of being a Christian. If you really want to live these things out with genuine faith, you're going to endure quite a lot. And in all the lifespan of the church, there has been and will be no other rule than this, and that is take up your cross and follow the guy that already took up his cross and died. Like, that is the rule. That is the way discipleship is done. And there's really no other way than that in the whole span of church history. Now, in sociology, they like to say that religion is a kind of instant self-gratification, that people believe these things and do these things just to sort of give themselves this feel-good sensation that they find rather pleasing. Well, the good thing about cross-centered Christianity is that it defies that understanding. It breaks us out of the normal worldly understanding of what religion is. Because if you have this idea of Christianity, there's nothing feel-good about it. I mean, there's no instant self-gratification here. This is about laying your life down. So very much puts us outside of all normal ways of understanding these religious ideas that people throughout the world kind of bandy around. And for that reason, I consider this passage and this kind of teaching truly important. It's not just an essential part of our faith, it's in defiance to the world's faithlessness. It takes away their whole argument, against viewing this as an actual faith from God. It actually shows them that this is something different than their theories and their speculations on what religion is. This true religion is very much a cross-centered one. But for all of its cross-centeredness, we also teach that the man who was hung on that cross eventually walked out of his tomb. That's the other side of this. It's not just the death, it's the resurrection. We don't just have the morbidity of all this focus on laying down your life. We have this greater hope laid up in store for us. Christianity is not a faith based on masochism. We get no pleasure out of the pain itself. We're not seeking the suffering for the sake of the suffering, but we do seek to endure the suffering in order to enjoy something better and greater later on, a hope of better things that Christ has laid up for us, that Christ has demonstrated for us by his resurrection. We may subject ourselves to rebuke and affliction and even death, but we endure those things with a goal that is beyond those things, and that goal is eternal life. And that is also the theme of today's passage, gaining life by submitting to death just as Jesus did. So both sides of that are very much important, and they are the two pillars of this message, really the two pillars of everything you're ever going to do as a Christian. And so that's how I want to address this passage this morning. My first point being that Jesus will soon win the victory of resurrection through the suffering of death. Verse 21, to read that again. From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and be raised up on the third day. I've tried to word my explanation here in the most daunting way possible, and this is what I came up with, that Jesus will suffer greatly by the unanimous agreement of the city of God. So that is what Jesus has just laid out here for his agenda for the rest of this gospel, actually, and for the rest of his time on the earth. He's going to suffer greatly by the unanimous agreement of the city of God. Now, to go through that in kind of a point-by-point fashion, Jesus must suffer greatly, or suffer many things, as Matthew words it. He's going to go through a lot. Now, we've seen already in Matthew's gospel that Jesus has enemies who wish to kill him. That is something that we encountered several chapters ago. Chapter 12, verse 14, after one of these Sabbath controversies that was so effective for ticking off the Pharisees. Chapter 12, verse 14, but the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. So amazingly, the enemies of Jesus are not content merely to see him dead. They want to destroy him. It's not enough for him to die. Death is too good for him. They want to just wage a war of utter destruction upon Jesus. And in our current passage, you see them go to that extreme. They want to make him suffer many things. So not just kill him, they're going to make him suffer. They're going to make him pay for being right all the times that they have been wrong, is basically what they have in mind for him. So with these enemies of Jesus, you never want to be left at their mercy because they have no mercy. Their religion is totally bankrupt of any concept of compassion or going easy on anyone. They are out for blood, and to spill as much blood from one man as they possibly can. That is their plan for Jesus. And yet Jesus is deliberately going to face these merciless men and suffer greatly at their hands. That's his plan. That's his agenda for the next several chapters of Matthew, to get to this point where they actually can do all those terrible things that they have planned. That's his whole purpose for going to Jerusalem. Speaking of Jerusalem, moving this on to the next part of my statement, the blood of Jesus' death is going to be on the city of God, as I have called it. And I call it that here for a reason. I include this as part of the daunting nature of Jesus' death, because if you get killed by the city of God, it makes you look like an enemy of God. If it's God's people who have passed judgment on you and have decided you're not fit to live, and in fact you're worthy of a rather torturous death, that reflects very poorly upon you. But that is exactly what Jerusalem did. Jerusalem, as the city of God, actually inflicted these sufferings on Christ. Jerusalem was the city where God chose to dwell in a temple. It was the place where he would set his name, and he actually had Solomon build that temple to be a temple for his name. It was the city that housed the kings chosen by God. David was the Lord's anointed. His sons were chosen as part of the covenant God made with David. This is the city of the kings appointed by God. And of course, Jerusalem was the city where the Messiah was destined to reign forever over the kingdom of God. So you have this forward-reaching plan, far longer than the past plan of God, that things that God had done in Jerusalem. Now you have this forward part of things where the Messiah is going to be there ruling forever. This is very much the city of God. And based on all of that, you would think that Jesus would be kind of going home, going to Jerusalem, going to the place where he's meant to be, the one place where he truly belongs. And yet, Jerusalem was the city where Jesus was surrounded and arrested like a common criminal, as though he were some dangerous threat. He was a threat to their false ideas, but not a threat to anyone's well-being, of course. And yet they treated him very much like a criminal. Jerusalem was the city where an innocent man was subjected to a rigged trial, where even those bringing false accusations against him could not agree in their false accusations, and yet he was executed anyway. Jerusalem was the place where the Messiah was murdered. This one man, upon whom the hopes of the whole world rest, upon whom the plan of God rests, this man was murdered there in the city of God, in Jerusalem. And the place of your suffering, the people who inflict it, and that sort of thing can make your suffering worse, depending on who's the one coming at you here. I mean, people who you kind of expect to be your enemies, well, if they come at you, you're not really as daunted by that. But if the city of God decides that you are an enemy of God, that is going to be all the more grievous for you if you're actually a servant of God, as Jesus was. And yet this is the place where he was going to die. That just adds to the grievousness of his death and these things that he is going to suffer at their hands. And then finally, Jerusalem's decision to make Jesus suffer in this way was practically unanimous. There were no significant dissenting voices at this point in history when they decided to make Jesus suffer and die. Now, people act through their representatives, usually. You have a whole city of people or a larger unit of people. Usually you have people that represent them who make the decisions for them on behalf of those people. Well, in Jerusalem, there was a high court which acted as the representatives of the people. That is known as the Sanhedrin. You'll also hear this called just the Supreme Court of the Jews. That's very much what it was. It was their highest court of law, and this is the court that we will see condemn Jesus to die by the time this gospel is done. Now, as for who exactly was on that court, what kinds of people you would find there if you were to go into a session of the Sanhedrin, there were three political parties, if you will. And I use that term. These are going to sound a little more like religious parties, but you got to remember back in that time and place, religion and politics were the same thing, and so they're political parties just as much as they are religious groups. So your first group, you have the chief priests, as they're called. And naturally, these men represent the various priestly families and the Levites and the temple system. So these are the people that are very much in their day job. They kind of go about the business of the temple, and then on the Sanhedrin, they go in there and argue their points from that perspective. So you have the chief priests, And in the second party, you have the scribes, also called the lawyers. These are the experts in the law of Moses. They represent the theologians and the teachers and the judges of Israel because they pretty much function in all those roles. If you have some sort of dispute, you need the law of God brought to bear on that issue, you go to the scribes. And the theology and the judicial aspect of things is all rolled into one. They're also the ones teaching you in your synagogue every Sabbath. So you have the second party of the scribes. And then the third party, simply known as the elders, the old men. These are the men who, through whatever means, had achieved enough respectability to warrant a place on the Jewish high court. These kind of represent everyone else in Israel. So you have the elders kind of taking up the slack of people that don't necessarily fall into the chief priest or scribal categories there. So those are the three political parties of the Sanhedrin. And all three of those parties would agree together to make Jesus suffer. He lists them out here in verse 21. He says he's going to suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. So they're all going to unite together in their opposition to Jesus, to kill him. And as you Americans know very well, it is nearly impossible to get political parties to agree on something together. Right? The whole idea of a political party, the reason you divide into those groups is because there are disagreements. And some group is going to take up this cause, and therefore of necessity, the other group's going to take up the opposite cause. And that's how the whole system works. Getting them all to have a consensus on something is just nearly impossible. And yet all three controlling parties of Jerusalem agreed on this one point: Jesus must die in the most excruciating way possible. Not just die, but die the most awful death that we can guarantee for him. They were all able to agree on that point. Jesus was viewed with such contempt that the politicians of Israel would have rather worked with their enemies than show him any leniency at all. And they were enemies. Don't think these guys were all kind of hanging out together as friends during these Sanhedrin sessions. Every group had their own agenda. They had very much their differences of opinion, and there would be a lot of bad blood in that Sanhedrin chamber. And yet somehow all of that was put to the side when Jesus came in, and they all decided this man needs to be crucified as soon as we can make it happen. So I hope you'll understand, based on all of that, why I call it daunting. You know, this is everything coming at Jesus here. He's going to suffer greatly by the unanimous agreement of the city of God. The whole weight of that nation is really coming upon Jesus, which does sound pretty daunting, pretty terrifying. But the one person who was not daunted by that was Jesus himself, right? Because Jesus is actually embracing the suffering of his death, not just dying, but this whole agenda that he knows is laid out for him. He is actually embracing this. You see in verse 21, this key word here, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem. Emphasis on the word must. Jesus states this as an imperative to himself. He has commanded himself. He is going to Jerusalem to endure these things. This is his plan, his self-adopted idea: go to Jerusalem and suffer in this way. And I often wonder what it would have been like for maybe unbelieving Jews who first encountered this idea. The people perhaps back then who were still very much not familiar with Christianity, maybe still in the generation after Christ, but still kind of hearing stuff about this Jesus guy. They probably would have viewed Jesus very naturally as someone who was outmaneuvered, someone who was exposed as a fake, someone who was overpowered by better men. You know, thank God that our leaders found this, faking prophet, this false healer, and did to him what ought to have happened. Probably that's the way they would have viewed it, right? And then they discover, perhaps through reading Matthew, perhaps through talking with Christians, that Jesus actually intended all of that to happen. That he was going to Jerusalem that day, not to try to take over, not really to try to get his teachings accepted, but specifically to die at the hands of these men. This was his whole plan. This makes Jesus a very unique man, even among martyrs. You have these people who die for their religious beliefs because they refuse to renounce them, but martyrs tend to die merely as a consequence of their beliefs. The idea wasn't actually to die. They weren't trying to get the wrath of people roused up against them so that they would die. That wasn't the goal. That just kind of happened. Jesus, on the other hand, is the world's greatest deliberate martyr. He's actually going here so that he can be killed for being who he is and saying the things that he says. That makes Jesus, in the history of martyrs, if you read about those kinds of people, there's really no one quite like Jesus who actually goes here with the purpose of enduring these things. The only thing perhaps more remarkable than that, him being a deliberate martyr, is the fact that he states this plan to his disciples just after his disciples declared him to be king. This is what happened last. The last story we read from Matthew before we went on our break was this confession made by Peter of Jesus as being the king of the kingdom of God. Verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Christ being the title of his royalty, of course. So here you have, finally, stated specifically, no interpretation here needed, stated emphatically, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, the King of God's kingdom that he's bringing about on the earth. Now, what is his first act as king? Now that this whole idea has become fully formed in the minds of his disciples, his first act as king is he plans to die. There's no plan for glory, no pomp or anything like that, no great takeover of the nation, no defeat for the Roman imperialists, none of that. His plan is to die a most horrible death. As surprising as it was, and unique as it was, and as seemingly senseless as it was, Jesus embraced the suffering of his death fully to the point where he is going to deliberately walk into Jerusalem knowing what is in store for him there, and he is going to endure those things. And the question is, why? Why do all of this? Why, when it seems like it seems like a bad idea. If you were there with Jesus, one of his disciples, would be like, hey, is this really the plan here, going there to die? Is that what you have in mind? So why is Jesus doing this anyway? Well, through his suffering and death, keyword through his suffering and death, Jesus will win the victory of resurrection. That's his real plan. See, the immediate plan is to go to Jerusalem and die. The ultimate plan is to be raised from the dead, which you also see there at the end of verse 21. He's going to be killed and be raised up on the third day. Important not to silence that last part. This is, in fact, the first clear statement, by the way, of the resurrection of Jesus so far in Matthew's gospel. So far, we haven't had any plain statement made about Jesus going to rise from the dead at any point. You have this cryptic statement about the sign of Jonah, being in the belly of the earth for 3 days, and just like, what? Okay, some kind of sign that he's going to give to people, but we don't really get a thorough explanation as to what that is until now. Now this sign of Jonah is very much explained. The 3 days in the belly of the earth is the 3 days of his death, being in the tomb until he rises from the dead. So we finally have this explanation here that Jesus is going to rise from the dead. But even though it's come pretty late in the gospel, this is the actual plan. Before Jesus even takes a step toward Jerusalem, he says, the plan ultimately is for me not just to die there, but to rise from the dead there. This is, again, not an afterthought. It's not like God saw Jesus die and say, oh, that was a mistake, I got to reverse this, I'll just raise him from the dead. No, that's part of the plan being worked out here. This was the whole idea. This was the intended goal, the ultimate goal for the death of Christ, to lead to this resurrection. Now, we treat the resurrection as a glorious thing, do we not? You can probably go through the hymn books, count the number of hymns that feature the resurrection. We have a whole holiday celebrating Jesus rising from the dead. Easter, if you celebrate Easter, if you want to call it Easter. All kinds of debates on that. We treat this as a glorious thing, though. The thing is about this, by definition, the glory of this resurrection is only possible for those who suffer the inglorious state of death, right? Okay, you can't be raised from the dead unless you're actually dead. Okay, so there's a foundational idea here. There's a criteria that must apply before you actually get to this joyful thing of the resurrection, and it involves death. And I find it interesting just to point that out because everyone wants this glory for themselves or whatever, but are you willing to go through what it takes? Well, Jesus maximum glory. I mean, he got raised from the dead in a way so spectacular, we're still talking about it 2,000 years later, but he got there through dying, and dying in a way that was not just bad, but full of suffering, with the whole wrath of a city coming down upon him at that time. Jesus was willing. I mean, not everyone is willing to go through what it takes to achieve glory. Jesus was willing. I mean, he's going to go there deliberately and endure these things so that he can have victory over death itself. And by the time he got through everything he endured, he had earned that victory. He had earned the glory of resurrection. And so God raised him from the dead. And this is what we see by this point in Matthew in this passage. We see that Jesus will soon win the victory of resurrection through the suffering of death. But that definitely sounds difficult as it is, but there's even more to the difficulty that we can add to it from this passage. And that is, Jesus embraces suffering for life. He embraces suffering for life in spite of the opposition from both earth and hell. And we see both in this passage, sort of two realms coming against Jesus to try to prevent him from embracing this life of suffering and also the reward of his suffering, that is his resurrection. The death of Jesus was preceded by a lifetime of trial, right? I'm sure that is in our heads. I think it sometimes gets eclipsed. Very naturally, we think of the suffering of Jesus mostly in terms of his death, right? The way he died. You know, going to Jerusalem, being tortured, being crucified, enduring the wrath of God for sins. We think very much of those things when we think of the suffering of Christ. Very easy, however, to forget all of the smaller trials that met him every day of his life. As he works out slowly this plan of God, single-handedly, even his disciples aren't much help in this regard, single-handedly just trying to push this thing through to conclusion against all the little trials and oppositions that he encounters day by day. Take this passage, for example. This story takes place in the same location where Peter confessed Jesus to be the Messiah, Caesarea Philippi. That's very much up in the extreme north end of Palestine, the land of the Jews. And now we're going to Jerusalem, right? So he's going to have to kind of trek across half the country to get to this point of destination here in Jerusalem where he is going to die. That's a long journey. It's going to be a very long trip. Not just in terms of distance and physically speaking, but spiritually speaking, it's going to be a long trip because he's going to endure a lot on the way, a lot of temptations to not do this. And he gets the first of these temptations right here, right now, before the trip even begins. Right here, verse 22 and 23, you see, before the journey even gets started, you see earth and hell coming together against Jesus. Verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you're a stumbling block to me, for you're not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. At the very start of the journey to Jerusalem, Satan is already trying to get in the way, using Peter to do that. So you already have this opposition from both earth and hell coming together to stop Jesus right here. I mean, the first time he states the plan to go to Jerusalem and die, immediately the opposition starts right there at that moment. What do you think is going to happen the rest of the way? I mean, there's going to be stuff happening to Jesus all the rest of the time, trying to get Jesus to be dissuaded from this course of action, and Christ is going to have to overcome that every step of the way. And that is what it's like to live the life of Jesus Christ. That's what he endured all his time on earth, and especially probably from here till the end. That's what it's like. Every day, something comes along to overthrow the entire plan of God for redemption, and every day, Jesus must overcome those things, and every day he does. Very much to his credit and to his glory, but still, that is not an easy life to live. That is a life where you're constantly enduring something, all for the sake of getting to the point where you can finally die according to plan. That is a very rough life to live. That is a lifetime of trial. But that was the fashion of Jesus' life leading up to his death, a lifetime of trial. Getting more intense, no doubt, as the life went on and came to its intended goal in the crucifixion and the resurrection. Now, to give that a little more detail, we're going to break apart the earth and hell part of that statement that I made, give a little more detail here, that Jesus must first endure mankind's disbelief. So there's one of the two major hurdles we have here. We have opposition from earth in the form of mankind's disbelief. Jesus will eventually face a whole city of people who will not understand why he is dying, why he's even there, what he's trying to do. And for that reason, they're going to treat him horribly. They're going to treat him in such a barbaric way that there's really, in our own culture, we can't even think about that. This is the way, we execute people in ways that are generally humane, right? We have this whole idea of cruel and unusual punishment that we try to avoid. Well, back then it's just like, whip him till the flesh comes off his back, nail him to a cross, make him suffocate to death. That's what's going to happen to him. And they're going to do that fundamentally because they don't understand what Jesus is trying to do. They don't get it at all. But even before he gets to that point, that's certainly unbelief. That's certainly the disbelief of mankind at work. But even before he gets there and deals with that, he's going to deal with that same disbelief in a very different form, from a very unlikely source. The rock of the church, Peter. This man we talked about, we spent a lot of time talking about him and his role as given in the prior passage where Jesus calls him, he says, I say to you, Peter, you are the rock. Upon this rock I'll build my church. Okay, so verse 22 here, Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Jesus says he's going to die and rise from the dead. Peter rebukes Jesus, saying, no, this will never happen to you. Now, the foundation of the gospel message is the death and resurrection of Jesus. It doesn't get any more basic than that. That is the foundation of the gospel message. But Peter, who was just declared to be the foundation rock of the church, considers the gospel worthy of rebuke. Jesus gives really the first preaching of the gospel, of the plain, straightforward gospel, right here, right now, and Peter's first response is to rebuke him for saying it. That's where we are right now in the history of the church. That's the rock where we started, Jesus started building on this guy, and that's where we started. Gospel equals rebuke. There you go. That's where we've started here. I can think of no better proof of how outrageous the gospel was to those who first heard it, other than to say that the primary disciple of Jesus did not believe it when he first heard it. He's been following Jesus for how long now? He should be ready to hear this kind of thing. And even if it was totally out of nowhere, it's Jesus talking. He should embrace this. Jesus is his master, is he not? Right? Instead, Peter hears this, and his instinct is to rebuke him. That is extreme disbelief. That kind of faithlessness in Peter at this point is just shocking. It's amazing that it came to that this disciple is going to rebuke his master over this point that would eventually become essential to everything Peter would preach for the entire rest of his life. That's where we are now. But just imagine that kind of disbelief there in Peter's mind. What he must be thinking, the way he recoiled against this idea. It's extraordinary. But now, come back to Jesus' perspective here, okay? Come back, imagine Jesus trying to get the disciples to understand his chief goal for his whole mission, only to get rebuked for it. There he is. He's finally come to the point where it's like, guys, okay, I'm going to tell you now, here's what I've been driving for this whole time. Here's where the plan is going. I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise from the dead. First response, rebuke. And then throughout the rest of this section, you don't really get the idea they get it at all. You see them get grieved at one point. Even after his death has happened, it's like they're not even expecting the resurrection to happen. Even though he told them it was going to happen, they still just don't get it. This kind of disbelief that Jesus gets hit with every single time he mentions this concept. Trying to get these guys to understand it, and they just don't or won't understand it. It's amazing. Just imagine a time maybe, or maybe it's just this way for you now. Let's say you tell people, your life goals. You have this desire. You want your life to end a certain way. You want your life to count for something. You have some big thing, some big plan for your life you want to see accomplished, whatever that may be. And every time you tell someone what that plan is, they say, oh, that's stupid. Why are you living for that? Why would you do that? You should be doing this other thing instead. Imagine if that is how you spent your whole life, okay? Now that's how Jesus spent his whole life. That is exactly what it was. He is going for this one goal, and the only person on the face of the planet who understands it is him. And every time he says it to someone else, all he gets is unbelief. Even from his disciples, even from the people that should get it, that's all he gets is unbelief. So Jesus is going to have those small doses of emotional suffering as he continually endures this disbelief, even from men of faith, even from men who to some degree believe in Jesus, have left all to follow him. Even their unbelief is going to be there, a constant thorn in his side, just dragging him down. So there's the opposition from earth, from mankind's disbelief. Now there's a much greater trial here at work too, and that is Satan's craftiness. This is the hell side of the equation. He has opposition coming from both earth and hell, and the opposition from hell is, of course, Satan's craftiness. Matthew 16, verse 23, how Jesus responds to Peter. But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you're not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." Get behind me, Satan. So Peter rebukes Jesus, and then Jesus rebukes Satan, who very much is operating behind Peter ultimately here, which is a jarring thought in and of itself, but sensible. You see, Satan is using a trick here that is old, but therefore time-tested. And that is, if you want someone to do something, but you know he won't listen to you, go get one of his friends to talk to him and see if he can convince him, right? I'm sure you've done that before. You want this person to do something, you want to get their attention in some way, but you know they're not going to listen to you, so you go to a mutual friend, and you try to get that friend on your side, and then that friend goes and talks to him. It's a very simple idea. It usually works, that's why people do it, or it works very often anyway. But that's exactly what Satan is trying to do here. You see, Satan has already failed in more deliberate efforts. In Matthew 4, we saw him do a full-on temptation in the wilderness when Jesus was fasting, right? Just very much tried deliberately to sway Jesus from his course of action, tried to get Jesus to worship him even. I mean, that was very deliberate, and that failed. That didn't turn out very well. So now Satan is going to go for intrigue. He's going to go for subterfuge. He's going to try to deceive Jesus by using the oldest trick in the book, trying to get a close friend, a disciple, to come speak for Satan on behalf of Satan. And Satan has chosen Peter to do that, right? The man that Jesus just declared to be his right-hand man, the steward of the kingdom of heaven, he who's going to have the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Satan chose that guy to come and deliver this word to Jesus about not going through with this plan. Now, it's easy to think that this would be nothing for Jesus. I mean, he seems to get it pretty clearly from the very beginning that this is actually the working of Satan going on behind the scenes. But bear in mind here, before you think it's just an easy thing for Jesus to deflect those things, Jesus calls this a stumbling block, okay? He says, you are a stumbling block to me. Now, a stumbling block may not sound like a very big thing to you, but these stumbling blocks Jesus talks about from time to time, they're big things. Let's read it from chapter 18, actually, verses 7 through 9. This is the kind of thing you're dealing with when you're dealing with a stumbling block. It's not just, oh, I stubbed my toe. You know, it's a lot worse than that. Jesus says this, Matthew 18, verse 7, "Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks." Woe to it. Okay, you're going to go out there, you're going to make someone trip and fall. You know, woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. For it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes. This is serious business. Jesus just pronounced a woe upon the world for these stumbling blocks, okay? Now here comes Peter, working unbeknownst to him on behalf of Satan. Here comes Peter to throw down a stumbling block in front of Jesus. You can honestly say there's a woe operating on Peter and on Satan at this moment. This is a huge deal. I mean, Jesus, this isn't just like, oh, this is nothing. I can handle this. Temptation is nothing for me. This is a stumbling block. This was a serious threat coming to Jesus here that he has to deal with at this time. And this is the kind of thing Jesus has to deal with probably his entire life and more as he got closer to his goal. These stumbling blocks being thrown down, not just from men, but also from Satan himself. He doesn't just have to deal with unbelieving believers, now he has to deal with Satan himself, a very deceitful enemy. It is remarkable and a testament to Jesus' holiness and his own dedication to God's plan. That's an understatement. It's a testament to Jesus' ability to endure these things so constantly and eventually arrive at his goal of enduring the cross and eventually being raised from the dead in spite of all of this opposition, both from earth and from hell. He was victorious anyway, even against all of this. This passage is just a microcosm of what Jesus had to deal with so often, with both men and demons trying to stop him from single-handedly fulfilling everything he had to do. And yet in this you see his victory. He does actually overcome these things, even though they are quite difficult. Now, Jesus goes a step further with all of this, and this is where I get my third point, and where it really becomes a matter for your attention. Jesus requires the disciples to share his resurrection by sharing his death. So far, the only topic of discussion has been what Jesus has said about his own suffering and resurrection. It's been very much a Christ-centered passage up until this point. But now he informs the disciples that they are slated for the same destiny. They didn't know it until now, but they have been set aside for a very special death and also the glory that follows that death. They have been slated for the same kind of destiny that Jesus himself had. Not just the suffering and not just the resurrection, but both. You see here in verses 24 and 25, Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So the original disciples, right there and then, we're going to start with them. The original disciples were required to follow Jesus on the road to crucifixion. You know, that journey to Jerusalem there, where Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem to die, it's like a working, picture of the entire rest of the disciples' lives as they are continuing to follow Jesus to the point where they too are going to die. And I emphasize die. We so often hear this talk about taking up your cross as a metaphor, as some kind of figure of speech, for the Christian life. I'd like to remind you that for the men who originally heard this statement, it was most certainly not a metaphor. And if they thought it was a metaphor then, they realized the truth of Jesus' words later on when it came time for them to die. Let me give you a bit of a history lesson about the 12 apostles. 3 of them were most certainly crucified. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. That's why this is called St. Andrew's Cross. You've maybe seen it on the flag of Scotland, actually. But Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece. And then you have James the Less, who was crucified in Egypt. So you have 3 of the 12 apostles who most certainly were crucified according to history. Furthermore, there are 2 more apostles who may have been crucified as well, but at least were martyred in some way. First of all, you have Philip. He was killed in Hierapolis. Some say it was by crucifixion. Others say it was by beheading. But one way or another, he died for his testimony as a Christian. And then the other one was Bartholomew. He was killed in Armenia. Again, some say it was by crucifixion. Others say it was again by beheading. So these 2 apostles, 2 more, certainly martyred, possibly by crucifixion, just like Jesus was. And then you have 5 more of the 12 apostles who were martyred, not by crucifixion, but who at least died very horrible deaths. You have James, the son of Zebedee. He was beheaded in Jerusalem. You can read about that in the book of Acts. Thomas was speared to death in India. And then you have Thaddeus and Simon, who were killed with axes in Beirut. So they were chopped up for being Christians. And then finally, you have the author of our gospel here, Matthew. He was martyred. We don't know how. We don't have the details on it, when or how it happened, but he also died. Not just died of natural causes, but was executed for being a Christian. So how many is that? That is 10. That is 10 of the 12 apostles dying in extreme pain at the wrath of man for their testimony as Christians. So only 2 escaped. One of them was Judas, who escaped because he betrayed Jesus and hung himself, so he doesn't count. And then you have John, who spent his last days exiled to the island of Patmos. So they went easy on him. They didn't kill him, they just exiled him, which I'm sure wasn't exactly a happy place to be, but that's how he ended. So you have the original disciples of Jesus very much facing death as martyrs for the name of Christ. There is nothing figurative about them taking up their cross. For some of them, it was quite literal, taking up their crosses and carrying them to the place of their crucifixion, just as Jesus did earlier. Very much literal. And for those who were killed without a cross, they were still being killed. And I'm sure they didn't see much of a difference at that time, being martyred as they were. This teaching for them was very much painful and lethal. Nothing figurative about it. There's no metaphor here. Taking up the cross was taking up your cross and following Jesus to the death. Now, to push this topic even further and make it even more relevant for you, we ourselves may yet see the day when taking up the cross is not so metaphorical for us either. We speak of it that way probably because we have nothing else to relate it to. Well, that might change in the near future. There are a lot of things changing in our society right now. I recently happened upon a book that was published in 2014, so that's 2 years ago now. It was called So Many Christians, So Few Lions. Interesting title. The authors were 2 sociology professors named George Yancey and David Williamson, and the aim of the book was to explore and document the fear and hatred of Christianity in America. So these 2 sociology professors have set out to study this phenomenon of anti-Christian sentiment here in our own country. And they wrote a whole book on it 2 years ago. Now, it will likely not be surprising to you, but one of their conclusions was that educated, wealthier people in our society are generally quite hostile to Christianity. So the more educated you get and the more money you have, the more you hate Christians, basically. That should not be too surprising. I think that is something that we're familiar with. It is certainly a threat to us because these are powerful people, but at the same time, not all that surprising. What may surprise you, and what did surprise the authors, was the way these people expressed their hatred, what they actually said about Christians when they were being interviewed. Oddly enough, their anger at Christians very often took the form of murderous threats. That is to say, saying things about killing Christians. The title of the book, So Many Christians, So Few Lions, was a verbatim quotation from one of the people they interviewed. Hey, what do you think about Christians? So many Christians, so few lions. Wish we just had more lions to eat them up. That's the kind of thing these people were saying. Here are some more quotations. Quote, I wish we could bring back the lions again or burn them at the stake. Next quotation, kill them all and let their God sort them out. Third quotation, I want them all to die in a fire. And then final, I abhor them and wish we could do away with them. Round them up, move them out, kill them all, basically. This is the kind of things they were saying in their interviews about Christians. Those are the thoughts of the educated, wealthier people in America, their candid thoughts regarding Christians. Lions and fires. There you go. That's what they want. That's the way they express themselves. Now imagine that these influential people manage to persuade a majority of Americans that such a policy is justifiable. That these Christians are actually worthy of our murderous hatred. Well, things would get pretty messy pretty quickly if that were actually the case. And our metaphorical interpretations of taking up your cross and following Jesus would probably disappear rather quickly because there'd be nothing metaphorical about it. If you hang a cross around your neck, don't be surprised if you get hung on the cross because that might actually be happening at some point. You never know. These are the influential people in our society saying these kinds of things. if that sentiment should spread, we could very much find ourselves in a situation much like those of the original disciples. Thankfully, Jesus does not end his comments there. There is a counterpart to this Christian suffering, and that is resurrection. Through sharing in Christ's suffering, the disciples also share in Christ's resurrection. Verse 25, "For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Now that phrase, lose your life and then find it, okay? That is the language of resurrection, of being dead and then coming back from the dead. Because to lose your life is to die, right? Okay? So after you have died, what would it mean to find your life again? Resurrection. Okay, so it's the language of death and resurrection, being raised from the dead. So this is what Jesus promises his disciples. If you lose your life for my sake, you will find it again. If you die for me, you will rise again. So this suffering for life, as I said, goes both ways. There's a double meaning there in that phrase that I gave this sermon this title. Yes, the Christian life brings with it the lifelong threat of death and all of the pain and all of the trial that comes with that. It could be no other way, of course, since the man we call Lord was condemned as a criminal and executed. As they've done to the master, so they will do to the students, right? You can't really expect anything other than that to happen. And yet, all of that adversity has a purpose, which is to gain a greater life. It's not entirely bound up in the death. The Christian life is not entirely composed of suffering. There is a goal here, something that has been promised to us by Jesus, that we also would share in his resurrection. And that also could have been no other way, since our Lord himself rose from the dead to live to God forever. I mean, that's what happened to him, and we're following him on the same road. What's going to happen to us? It could end in nothing else other than our own resurrection. The Christian life is certainly full of trial. We have a lot to endure. Things that the rest of the world just doesn't have to worry about, just because they don't have the added responsibilities of being a Christian and the heaviness of eternity on us, so to speak. And as time goes on, the prospect seems to get worse and the possible trials seem to increase. When you get rich, wealthy people talking about throwing us to lions and burning us at the stake and things like that. It just seems to get worse and worse. But just as the gospel ends in resurrection, so the Christian life ends in resurrection. Death doesn't win. Death does not win. It didn't win against Jesus, and it won't win against us either. There is a promised resurrection in store for us. And sure, you could go the other way with it. I mean, you could do what Jesus said at the first, right? Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. You could try to do that. You could try to save your life. You could sort of say, this whole following Jesus thing, not really for me. I don't want to risk dying in a gruesome way. I just won't do that. Well, you can do that, and then you'll die anyway, right? It's going to happen. I mean, eventually your time's going to run out, and you're going to die. And what's the good of trying to save your life then, right? I mean, you're still dying. It's going to happen anyway, except now you die a faithless coward. You didn't have any faith in Christ that he could deliver on his promises. You didn't have any courage to face those things. So now not only are you dying, you're dying in absolute lack of virtue. What good is that? It would have been 1,000,000 times better to endure the cross, even literally, and be resurrected with the righteous on the last day. I mean, then there's something to show for it. Yeah, you're going to die still. It might die sooner than later, but your death is going to be much better, and then you're going to have this promise laid in store for you of new life. Just consider Jesus. Again, just the author and perfecter of our faith, right? Consider Jesus. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the man who walked out of his own tomb after being crucified. After steadfastly going into that just hive of wickedness that was Jerusalem at that time, going in there to face these things, enduring them totally, and then gaining the victory of resurrection. We're still telling that story. We're living for that story. I mean, could you write a better ending to that story? I mean, could you improve on that at all? It just doesn't, you can't. It is a story of maximum glory, the gospel is. Now, could you write a better ending to your own story, for example? How do you want your story to end? Oh, he became a fragile old man and died in a nursing home. The end. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'd really like to have that end. Wouldn't it be better to faithfully endure all of the hostility of the world for Christ's sake, and then at the end, share his glory? That's a better ending to the story. That's the ending of the story that I want for myself. That's the ending of the story we should all want for our own lives. And that's what Jesus is exhorting his disciples to do here. Not just to share in his death, but to also share in his resurrection. I refer to it as a requirement. And he does command them to do this. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It is very much the language of command. But when you see what he's offering beyond the death part of it, it's more like an invitation to something greater. Yeah, you got to go through this terrible thing, but in the end, it's just so much better. So much better than desperately trying to save your own life just to lose it anyway and lose it forever. Would have been much better to lose your life for Christ's sake and then share in the glory of his resurrection. And that is what I mean ultimately by suffering for life. Not just the duration of our suffering as Christians, but also the goal of it, to gain this new life that Jesus himself has already exemplified in his resurrection. I just want to give you the summary again of these things, just so you have them here at the end. My first point, that Jesus will soon win the victory of resurrection through the suffering of death. On the one hand, Jesus was about to suffer greatly by the unanimous agreement of the city of God, as he himself predicts in this passage. But Jesus was not daunted by this at all. Instead, he embraced the suffering of his death wholeheartedly and pursued that faithfully. Excuse me. And he did that because he knew through the suffering of his death, he would win the victory of resurrection and have much greater glory than all of the inglorious ways that he was tortured at the time of his death. Secondly, my second point, Jesus embraces suffering for life in spite of the opposition from both earth and hell. The death of Jesus was preceded by a lifetime of trial, of which we see just a single moment in the passage's confrontation with Peter when he comes and rebukes Jesus. That's just a little snippet of what Jesus had to deal with for all of his life, and especially as he drew closer to the cross. First, Jesus had to endure mankind's disbelief, as seen in Peter's rebuke. But also, Jesus faced the much greater trial of Satan's craftiness, which was, in this case, the true force behind Peter's actions in rebuking Jesus. So he had to endure both things, both from earth and from hell, as he went onward toward the cross. Thirdly, Jesus requires the disciples to share his resurrection by sharing his death. The original disciples were required to follow Jesus on the road to crucifixion, which for them was no figure of speech. 10 out of 12 of them died as martyrs, of course, so certainly not a metaphor for them. And furthermore, we ourselves may yet see the day when we have to endure the same thing just because of our own culture turning against us, as other cultures in the world already are. It's not like there are no Christians suffering anywhere in the world. That is very much happening elsewhere and can easily start happening here as well. But in spite of all of that, and also through all of that, disciples ultimately share in Christ's resurrection if they are willing to share in the suffering of his death as well. That is the entrance requirement to glory, sharing with Christ in the inglory of his death. And that is what I have to say about this passage. Again, we're going to kind of resume in the same place next time because I have more to say about all of this and then just go a little further in the passage. But for now, we're going to cut off there at verse 25. Are there questions or comments or anything that anyone wants to share about this? Yes.